I want to talk today about the hypocrisy of the summit itself that was organized by the United States. I hesitated to call the summit the so-called Summit for Democracy. A better name would, of course, be the Summit for Hypocrisy. If we look at who was invited, it was essentially a motley crew of US allies and client regimes, and many countries that are significantly more democratic than the Western bourgeois so-called democracies. For instance, in 2022, there was a study published by a group called the Alliance of Democracies, which was founded by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former Secretary General of NATO. And this is an organization funded by Western governments. And they conducted a study of countries around the world and their population's view of democracy. And they found that according to a survey of people actually in each country, the two most democratic countries on earth are China and Vietnam. In China, 83% of people consider their government to be democratic. In Vietnam, 77% of people considered their government to be democratic. Can we guess what the number was in the United States? 49%. That is to say, a minority of North Americans consider their government to be democratic. That is to say, a majority either don't consider it democratic or don't have an opinion. Functionally, according to that metric, which I would consider the most important metric, the United States is not a democracy. And yet, of course, China was not invited to this so-called Summit for Democracy organized by an undemocratic country, which is actually an oligarchy, the United States. Instead, the US invited its allies. And I want to show just an image here that includes some of the people who were invited, some of the leaders who were invited, these glorious defenders of democracy. Of course, we have Joe Biden, who often can't remember where he is, but he can remember to condemn China for supposedly not being democratic. We have that noble crusader for democracy, Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been prime minister on and off for 15 years, longer than any other leader, including David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of the Israeli colonial regime. Right now, there are mass protests going on in Israel against his authoritarian regime, not to mention, of course, the millions of Palestinians who live under apartheid and military occupation. But even within 48 proper, within the Israeli colonial regime, there are mass protests going on against his blatant attack on the very few remnants of bourgeois liberal democracy that exist in that settler colonial state. So the fact that he was invited, I mean, it's just laughable. That alone is preposterous. You also have another noble defender of democracy, the far-right president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, who likewise is overseeing an extremely reactionary right-wing authoritarian regime that is systematically undermining even bourgeois liberal democracy. I think everyone here agrees that bourgeois democracy is certainly not democratic. This is a system in which capitalists, the rich oligarchs, control the political system. So it's a much better term to describe it would be oligarchy, not democracy. But even within the very small parameters of bourgeois liberal democracy that exist, they are being completely eroded by these fascistic figures like Duda. I should point out that Duda of Poland was invited, but Hungary was not invited, despite the fact that Poland and Hungary have very similar governments. Both are right-wing, conservative, religious, reactionary regimes that systematically violate the rights of minorities, of migrants and refugees in particular, that are attacking women, that are undermining workers' rights, that are demonizing the LGBT community. They're very similar politically, and yet Poland was invited and Hungary was not. Why is that? It's very obvious. Poland is a staunch ally in this proxy war against Russia. Poland is viciously anti-Russian. As a neighbor of Ukraine, it has been a main supporter of the proxy war, providing weapons. And Hungary has been trying to maintain an independent, non-aligned foreign policy, balancing the West on one side against Russia and China on the other, maintaining good relations with both sides. So despite the fact that Hungary, like Poland, is a member of NATO and the EU, it was not invited. Poland was. Similarly, Turkey, formerly known as Turkey, a member of NATO, which also has a reactionary government, was not invited. And the answer is why. The answer why is very clear, because like Hungary, Turkey is maintaining an independent, non-aligned foreign policy, balancing the West against China and Russia. And like Hungary, actually, Turkey has tried to negotiate peace negotiations, peace talks to end the proxy war in Ukraine. So it was punished by not being invited to the so-called Summit for Democracy. Going down further, we have probably the most fascistic leader in the world today, Narendra Modi. I mean, India right now has an extremely right-wing government led by the BJP, a Hindu nationalist party that is the political arm of a fascist paramilitary group, the RSS, which its early leaders like MS Golwalker quite literally were inspired by Nazi Germany. He wrote a book, We Are Nation Defined, in which he said that the RSS directly was inspired by the Nazis and the so-called racial purity of the Third Reich. And he said that it's a lesson for us in Hindustan. And here we have, a government that is systematically violating the rights of not only religious minorities like Muslims and Christians and Buddhists and atheists, but also the Indian government is violating the rights even of lower caste Hindus. So, I mean, this is a regime that is deeply authoritarian. Ironically, a week before Modi was invited to speak at this so-called Summit for Democracy, the Indian government, the justice system, which is deeply politicized and corrupt, sentenced the main opposition leader, Rahul Gandhi, to 2 years in prison on completely specious, absurd charges based on a joke he made during the electoral campaign in 2019, where he referred to Modi, the prime minister, and 2 other corrupt capitalist oligarchs whose surnames are also Modi. He jokingly said, "What's up with all of these Modis whose last name, or all these these thieves whose last names are Modi?" And now he's been sentenced to 2 years in prison over defamation charges for joking about people whose surname is Modi who are corrupt. Clearly, this is a politically motivated campaign aimed at preventing Rahul Gandhi from running in the 2024 election that's coming up in just 1 year, the federal election. And he has also been suspended from the Indian parliament. So once again, I mean, the hypocrisy is quite preposterous. I do want to point out, because, I do talk a lot about the importance of multipolarity and the BRIC system. I should point out that the United States, this is a clear strategy that it's been taking to try to weaken the BRIC system. And Mike Pompeo himself boasted about this, former CIA director turned Secretary of State under Donald Trump. He boasted before leaving office that the US was trying to use the far-right leader in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, and Modi in India to weaken and divide the BRIC system. And M.K. Bhadrakumar, the former Indian diplomat and brilliant geopolitical analyst, he on his website has been warning that India is the weakest link within the BRIC system. And by Biden inviting Modi to the Summit for Democracy, it's another example of this. I mean, I should also mention, not to beat this point dead, but India is a member of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is popularly known as the anti-China NATO. So while India is maintaining a non-aligned policy on Russia, and the West, the US, has been unsuccessful in its attempts to pressure India to condemn Russia over the proxy war in Ukraine, it has been unable to convince India to soften its diplomatic ties with Russia. And India has significantly increased its trade with Russia, especially because Russia is selling India cheap oil and gas and wheat and fertilizer below market prices. And the point is that this is all part of an attempt by the United States to divide the world into multiple camps and recruit those countries for its new Cold War. I mean, the other people I had in that image of the US Summit for Democracy include the authoritarian leader of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, who's objectively not a democratic leader. I mean, in brief, under Zelensky, all communist and socialist parties have been made illegal. Collective bargaining rights have been suspended for basically all workers. It is illegal to form a union for 3/4 of workers in Ukraine. He has been imposing neoliberal shock therapy policies, while simultaneously ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange and announcing that Ukraine is open for business for Western capital to buy up the country, with $400 billion in assets being sold off by the Ukrainian state. So we see an objectively authoritarian neoliberal regime in Ukraine that is not dissimilar to Pinochet's regime, right, in Chile, or Suharto's regime in Indonesia. And yet he's a representative of democracy at the Summit for Democracy. And then, of course, there is Italy's Mussolini-admiring prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, who was the youth leader of the youth wing of the fascist movement created by not only Mussolini supporters, but quite literally war criminals who were in Mussolini's regime, and later founded the Italian social movement and subsequent parties. And her party today, Fratelli d'Italia, the Brothers of Italy, they use the same symbols of the Italian fascist movement founded by Italy's followers. I mean, the reason she was invited is very clear. Meloni has also supported Ukraine in this proxy war against Russia. Meloni just visited Kiev, where she met with Zelensky, where you have two far-right authoritarian leaders repressing their workers at home in this moment of extreme capitalist crisis, which is what fascism is. It's capitalism in decay. And the United States is more than willing to support them and invite them to its so-called Summit for Democracy, which again is a summit for hypocrisy, because even despite the very significant limitations of bourgeois liberal democracy, which I think we all agree is not democratic, despite that, the US is more than willing to turn a blind eye to these blatant violations of basic civil liberties, of basic human rights, of basic workers' rights, in order to recruit countries for its new Cold War on China and Russia. That was what this summit was all about. The fact that a country that is systematically violating the rights of all of its people, like Israel, India, Ukraine, Poland, the fact that they were invited, and the fact that non-countries were invited, like Taiwan, which is a province of the People's Republic of China. The United States recognizes that on paper, legally, when the United States signed the first Shanghai Communique, the first of the three communiques in 1972, when Richard Nixon visited Beijing and normalized relations. We know that in that agreement, the Shanghai Communique, the United States says that it recognizes that there is one China on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, and Taiwan is part of China. By inviting Taiwan separatists, this is the United States saying that it supports separatism or it doesn't recognize the People's Republic of China as a legitimate state. So it's not only an attack on the democratic nature of the Chinese government, with its all process people's democracy, which is not a system of bourgeois democracy. It's actually more democratic than bourgeois capitalist democracy. So not only is the US attacking the legitimacy of the democratic system in China, it is attacking the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China as a sovereign state sitting at the United Nations, recognized by international law, by violating the Shanghai Communique and inviting Taiwanese separatists. For me, that says everything about the purpose of this summit for hypocrisy. I probably went longer than I should have spoken, but it's a real pleasure. I want to thank you for the invitation. And it's important to hear from all these different perspectives of people around the world that show other models of democracy, countries that were not invited to participate in the so-called US Summit for Democracy, but I would argue are significantly more democratic, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like China. There's a lot that we can learn from those governments' models for how to actually include working people's power in a democratic system and not only capital's voice in a so-called democracy. So thanks a lot.